The US says it acted decisively in Venezuela, capturing dictator and reshaping the country's future. But power structures on the ground remained untouched, and the consequences may stretch far beyond Latin America. Joining me now in the studio is Paul Lewandowski, a US Army veteran and YouTube host. Paul, it's my pleasure to have you here in our studio in 2026. Hi.
Thanks, and Happy New Year. Always glad to be here.
Thank you, Paul. So, regarding Venezuela, that's quite an interesting beginning of the year. So how is the United States reacting right now? Because I don't see much of the American media right now. So how do people react? How politically the United States is reacting and institutionally?
So to break it out, there is a media reaction that has actually been really puzzling to me because, as you pointed out, on the ground in Venezuela, the government is 100% intact. Maduro's designated successor, the vice president of the country, is in charge of the country. The military stands behind her. The court system, the police, the army, all of these institutions are intact. There is zero doubt that while Maduro is gone, and certainly good riddance, the regime that he heads remains completely intact. And a lot of people forget Maduro himself was not the charismatic strongman that facilitated the original coup. He himself is the successor to Hugo Chavez. And so inexplicably, though, the United States media has treated this as though regime change has happened, as though the U.S. has invaded the country and toppled the government and is going to install a new one. None of those things have happened, and it is incredibly bizarre to me to see coverage that reflects a different reality. And the administration certainly has encouraged this. They seem to genuinely believe that what they have enacted is a regime change, and that itself has been very perplexing. On the institutional side, it's also been less perplexing, but no less frustrating. Congress, under the U.S. Constitution, has to declare war, either through a formal declaration of war or, as has been done in the past couple of decades, provide some kind of legislative authorization for use of military force. A broad authorization was given actually after the 9/11 attacks to go after terrorists associated with the 9/11 attacks. And for 20 years, that authorization was used by presidents to persecute wars in Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan. And so no such authorization exists for the U.S. military to target Venezuela. And so the fact that Congress itself seems to be okay with becoming an increasingly powerless institution is also strange and disturbing to me.
Right. Paul, so we discussed how media is reacting. We discussed how the institution and the Congress is reacting. But what about just American public? How do they react on President Trump's decision to attack Venezuela, to capture Maduro?
I think the U.S. public is equally confused. Prior to this action, polling data showed that overwhelmingly Americans did not want to intervene in Venezuela. The experience of a 2-decade-long insurgency in Iraq and Afghanistan, both of which achieved really nothing of strategic value for the United States, really has soured, I think, the U.S. public on interventions. But I'm always sort of in shock that there is a fairly large segment of the U.S. public that simply will agree with any policy implemented by Donald Trump. And part of that, I think, is a reflection of kind of his control of the media ecosystem and his cult of personality. He's simply, he's a man who literally 2 weeks ago was complaining that he wanted to be the peace president and should have gotten a Nobel Peace Prize. And now he's staging massive military interventions, and somehow Trump supporters believe both of these things can be true. It's bizarre, but again, the U.S. public as a whole, I haven't seen any polling data to really tell what the reaction is by the public after the fact.
Right, but was President Trump's decision reckless in your view?
Yes. The ultimately the U.S. military and the lives of our soldiers should only be used in extreme circumstances where a vital U.S. strategic interest is at play. And the Trump administration has offered no real vital interest that the singular act of capturing Maduro resolves. They've cited, for example, drugs coming into the United States. And certainly hundreds of thousands of Americans have been killed with fentanyl. But Venezuela is not a fentanyl-producing country. And in fact, the drug charges Maduro is facing don't include anything about fentanyl. He's charged only with cocaine trafficking, which kills a fraction of the Americans that fentanyl does. So there's not a drug interdiction or anti-drug vital interest here. There's some arguments about oil production, but the U.S. itself has sanctioned Venezuelan oil. We've chosen not to purchase it. So instead of a military intervention, we could have just decided to buy Venezuelan oil again. Alternately, again, we are an oil exporting country. We don't need oil. We export more petroleum products than we bring in. And so it can't be an oil strategic interest. And it's not regime change or bringing democracy to Venezuela because the regime hasn't changed and Venezuela is not currently a democracy. And so you're left with this conclusion to say that it's not clear that there was a vital strategic interest. It seems more like this was actually just President Trump using the military to capture an individual whom he didn't like.
Okay, but where could this lead in the longer term for the US and for the region?
Well, I think it definitely sends a message that the United States is willing to go after individuals who operate on who oppose the president. Now, is that going to change the behavior of other countries? That I'm not sure, because again, Maduro seems to have uniquely drawn the ire of President Trump personally. And again, the regime remains intact. And so do other governments in, say, the Cuban government, are they going to look and say, oh, well, we should become more friendly towards the United States because of this? Again, maybe someone in charge of Cuba would, but it's not clear that Cuba has a Maduro-like figure at the helm. You also have sort of governments that are like vaguely leftist. Again, you think like Lula in Brazil. This is somebody who's, again, vaguely leftist, vaguely anti-Trump, but he's not someone like Maduro, someone who's really relies on an anti-American worldview to motivate his own power base. So I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure what this will achieve in terms of other countries, like changing their behavior to be more amenable to the United States. Certainly, they will resent the United States, given that now when we make requests to them to change their policies, trade policies or migration policies, it's done so now with the implicit threat that if we don't like what you do, we're just going to kill you or extradite you to the United States, and your replacement will either get in line or also have to get kidnapped. But again, you can't run a foreign policy apparatus as a series of kidnappings. I mean, you can, but I guess it's not very productive. And ultimately, countries you need, like, you cannot just coerce countries through a series of kidnappings to do what you want.
Actually, yeah, that was what I was thinking, that of course we understand that Maduro is a dictator, but do democracies like the United States behave this way? I mean, this is kind of a crossing the line, how democratic countries should behave.
Right. It's the classic move of so many people say, oh, Venezuela should be free, and the people of Venezuela should be free to determine their own destiny. But the U.S.'s explicit policy is, no, you haven't fled an authoritarian regime. It's just the same regime under slightly new management.
Absolutely. But as a military person, Paul, did you expect it was coming? Because the end of the December of 2025, the news were quite disturbing.
Yeah, this is not something that I expected. Again, as we've talked about, it doesn't serve a larger national security objective that I can figure out. And ultimately, the U.S. military exists to enable and empower the government to achieve its national security objectives, right? Either through deterring our enemies or, if necessary, using force to stop them. And again, without what objective did we achieve other than helping the president himself settle a personal vendetta against another president?
Right. But what message actually everything that happened in Venezuela it sends to Putin? Because, you know, the media all around the world are now talking about how, you know, it seems like very ironic when Trump is capturing Maduro while he's rolling a red carpet in front of Putin.
Right. This is another one of those things that sort of leaves me scratching my head, is the argument that, oh, well, maybe this was a message or a deterrent to other powerful countries like Russia and China that they should be careful around the United States, that the United States maintains this ability to check them, right? Put the fear of God in them. But the argument that doesn't really make sense then is, one, the U.S. has to say it. The U.S. has to come out and be like, you were friends with these people and you can't be friends any longer, right? And when asked, that's not what we said. The administration talked about oil and drugs and all these other things. And the other problem is that you might recall that prior to this operation, when Venezuelan sanctioned oil tankers were painting Russian flags on their side and claiming to be flying under the Russian flag. And doing so, the administration actually waved them through. So on one hand, they expressed this real deference to Russia and an unwillingness to confront Russia in any way, shape, or form. And then, so you can't really argue that there was another different message being projected by this attack on Maduro. And of course, the most obvious thing is that the best way to deterring Russia has failed. That he's currently in Ukraine. He's invading a country that the U.S. is allied with, a U.S. ally. And so the idea that somehow deterring Russia is best done through a very convoluted, strange, again, targeting of an individual, it doesn't really make any sense when the same objective could be achieved, again, with much greater effect, with way less resource commitment, which not risking U.S. boots on the ground, through more robust support to Ukraine. Again, under scrutiny, this deterring other world powers analysis just sort of falls apart.
And could Russia's economy, from your perspective, be affected in any serious way by what is happening in Venezuela?
No, because Venezuela, the primary sustainer of the Russian economy is still petrochemicals, is still oil and gas, and they export them, as does Venezuela. And so the one thing they don't really have to benefit each other is actually they both produce the exact same thing. And so the idea that Venezuela and Russia, well, certainly every country benefits by having strong, well-positioned allies around the globe. The Russian economy really has almost no discernible dependency on Venezuela. Perhaps a little bit of the Russian arms industry sells stuff to Venezuela, but Venezuela is very broke, and the one part of the Russian economy that does not need external support is their arms industry. They buy all the weapons they need to fund their war machine.
But how much, as long as you touch China, how much influence does China actually have in Venezuela today?
Well, that China is essentially the buyer of Venezuelan oil. And that gives them a lot of leverage, certainly trading oil for cash that Venezuela needs to pay off its international debts and obligations. That has been the regime's basically go-to plan to try to stabilize their economy, which again is not good. But that if that is the U.S.'s goal, then simply offering the regime a better deal for oil would have achieved the exact same effect without having to risk U.S. troops on the ground. And so, again, the U.S. is the ones who have chosen not to purchase Venezuelan oil. It's very, so it doesn't make a lot of sense to sit there and say, oh, well, this was about sending China a message. We sort of forced through Venezuela into China's arms through our sanction policies.
Paul, can you call what happened in Venezuela as a war? Is that a war that were lasting for 30 minutes?
It was certainly an act of war. Again, under U.S. law, that was an act of war. It should have gotten a congressional declaration. There are small carve-outs for the president. He's allowed to take action militarily without congressional authorization, but only in instances of imminent threat, immediate danger, none of which Maduro posed. I don't think even the president argued that Maduro was some kind of imminent national security threat that required him to bypass Congress. So it was definitely a war. Are we currently in a state of war with Venezuela? Maybe not. So yeah, a 30-minute war might not be the worst characterization.
How Russia could use this attack on Venezuela in her favor? In Russia's favor.
Well, yeah, it's a propaganda victory for Putin for sure. Mm-hmm. One of the core tenets that the U.S. argues is to say, listen, we are a democracy, we are a free market economy, and we are part of an alliance that respects these fundamental values. The idea that the governments cannot seize the property of other individuals, that these governments have mutually consensual relationships with other countries, even small countries. The reason they want to join NATO, the reason they want to join EU, the reason they want to join NAFTA is because these are mutually beneficial relationships done with they're friendships, right? They're done with consent, that we are not an imperial power. And for Vladimir Putin, who engages in imperial power politics, coercion, force, including military force, right? This operation looks very similar to what Vladimir Putin did in Georgia in 2008. Putin gets to look and say, listen, other countries, as you can see, America is nothing special. They're no different than me. They're no different than China. They have no values other than their own interest. And so if we, Russia, offer you better security or more protection or a better deal, you should just take it, because all imperial powers are exactly the same, or all large global powers behave exactly the same. And so that's the message you're almost certainly going to see coming out of Russia and coming out of China. And it's unfortunate because, again, every objective could have been achieved without having to grant Putin and Xi Jinping this huge propaganda victory that they are going to message to the global stage.
Trump is going to meet Xi Jinping in a visible future, right?
I know he keeps talking about that. The Chinese are notorious for finding things that the president wants and then extracting concession after concession from him and never actually letting him get the carrot. So I'm not saying it won't happen, but the Chinese are going to, why give someone something they want without extracting concessions first? The Chinese have proven to be quite good at it. You notice in 2025, at least 3 different times, the U.S. was close to a China deal and was just negotiating to finalize the China trade deal. And every time, of course, the Chinese get concessions and then they layer on a few more. And again, why shouldn't they? They're tough negotiators, and the White House, if they're willing to play these games with China and give them what they want, why wouldn't China extract more?
Yeah, I do agree with you that Chinese are one of the best diplomats in the world. And, the way they're doing their game, it's quite interesting. And the reaction from Beijing was quite moderate regarding what happened in Venezuela. So, yeah, quite predictable. Don't you think that Washington is at risk of getting stuck in Latin America and pulling attention and resources away from Europe and Ukraine especially?
That is what the U.S.'s national security strategy document seems to outline. It really reframes the U.S. as a regional power. But as we've pointed out, the U.S. is so economically massive, so militarily large, that there's not really any argument to be made that any substantive portion of the Latin American economy or Latin American resources aren't able to be, that the U.S. doesn't have access to those markets. So it's tough to really argue. It's sort of like cleaning one room in your house again and again and again and again, even long after it's clean. At some point, the U.S. has to sit there and go, oh, okay, we're kind of a global power. There's not really any substantial headway these other countries are making into Latin America. And maybe that will cause the U.S. the administration to conclude that, oh, maybe we should start behaving like a global power again. But yeah, it's a real risk. It's a real risk that this administration will simply become almost neurotically fixated on Latin America. Certainly their immigration fixation is tied into that. You know, there's a reason if you look at the photos of Trump supervising the operation, Stephen Miller, White House Homeland Security advisor, is right there, despite this very clearly not being a Homeland Security issue. And I think that's a reflection of just how really bizarrely fixated the administration is on immigration, despite not really having achieved that much.
And Donald Trump is keep saying that the United States needs Greenland for security reason. Do you think Greenland is also at risk?
Yeah, you know, 2 weeks ago I would have said no, that this is just sort of bluster from the administration, but now I'm really not so sure. It's not clear the Europeans have the will or desire or ability to militarily contest that. And again, it's one of those things where the U.S. already has bases in Greenland, where our NATO allies permit and even welcome U.S. military personnel stationed in the country. So it really is perplexing to me that the U.S. wants to add it to their map. It's incredibly strange. It doesn't make any sense, or it only makes sense again as sort of a bizarrely personal whim of the president. So again, 2 weeks ago I would have said absolutely not, but now anything's on the table. But again, you ask yourself, will it achieve any kind of major strategic objective? Not really.
But do you remember when just in 2025, maybe there was spring or beginning of summer, when Trump said that he is not excluding the idea of taking Greenland by force? And you know, as you said, 2 weeks ago, I would think no, Trump wouldn't do that. And you know, after 3rd of January, I'm wow, because obviously people in Greenland, they're not eager to join the United States.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is sort of the calculus that's so hard for me to figure out. So if you're Russia, and let's make this national security argument frame, I'm sort of skeptical at baseline. I think it's a little antiquated, but sure. Let's say that it's important for the U.S. military to deter Russia by holding Greenland and having military troop forces stationed there. Well, if you're Russia, currently there are U.S. military forces stationed in Greenland. And if the U.S. wants to position additional forces there, certainly our NATO allies have shown repeatedly that they're totally open to it. We had a bunch of bases there in the Cold War. They would happily let us reopen them. And during the Cold War, our tight alliance with NATO told Russia that, hey, not only is Greenland protected by the United States military, but also by the Danish military and, in effect, by the UK, France, right, all NATO members. And so by annexing Greenland, you really are going to have the same basic opportunities to station military forces in Greenland that you already have, but instead of having a airtight alliance that stands together to deter Russia, you're telling Russia, hey, actually, Greenland is now only protected by the United States and that NATO allies have no plans on showing up to assist in the event of Russian aggression. And that, I think, is, again, one of those things where you can achieve your same objective by doing way less and maintaining, again, the integrity of the NATO alliance, which is an additional layer of deterrent power against Russia.
What do you think? What do you think they're gonna do with Maduro and his family?
Well, I mean, I think he's going to face the charges. Some of the charges, I actually think he'll get thrown out. Some of them are almost farcical. For example, they charged him with possession of a machine gun or destructive device. And in the United States, certainly possessing a machine gun without having proper licensure is a crime. But Maduro has not ever been in the United States, and he certainly hasn't possessed any machine guns here. The charge seems to stem from the fact that he's the head of the Venezuelan armed forces. So the idea that you can be charged in U.S. court for holding a machine gun while the head of a foreign, being the commander-in-chief of another country's armed force is kind of absurd. And I actually will be shocked if that goes forward. Again, unless there's something that I don't know about, if he was in the country somehow. Some of them, again, some of the charges might be more able to stick, right? The drug trafficking or knowingly participating in drug trafficking. But that also may be tough because to prove that in court, you have to have, they may find themselves having to disclose sources and methods. For example, if the U.S. intelligence was tapping Maduro's phone and that evidence gets presented in court, well, now you've demonstrated to Maduro's defense some of the capabilities of the U.S. intelligence apparatus. You also have even more complicated issues of specifics about U.S. evidence law. I mean, this administration has had far easier charges get tossed in federal court. They actually have done an unbelievably poor job of prosecuting cases. For example, there was a protester who was on camera throwing a Subway sandwich at a Border Patrol agent on camera, known by name, but the administration so bungled the whole investigation that that guy ended up walking. So if you can't prosecute a sandwich thrower successfully who did it on camera in front of a literal sworn law enforcement agent, I think they may actually have a tougher time prosecuting a head of a foreign government, especially without having to out their U.S. intelligence apparatus capabilities.
And who is currently running Venezuela?
The vice president, the designated successor to Maduro. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've heard that Trump was also threatening her that she has to collaborate, otherwise she will be in New York captured, as well as Maduro.
Yeah, that seems to be the strategy now, is just to threaten to kidnap people until they do what you want. Again, the thing to remember is that, one, the Venezuelans may not be as wealthy or have as large a military as the United States, but they're not stupid. And the U.S. showed the Venezuelans at least one way that we can capture a world leader and extradite them to New York. But the Venezuelans are going to learn. So the next time, again, they're going to patch the holes in their defenses. They're going to make things a little tougher. They're going to be a little bit more difficult to track. And if that's the plan by the administration, to simply do a kidnapping operation against every leader until they find someone willing to do the U.S.'s bidding, you may not be able to go back to the well again and again and again and again.
Right.
And so that's, I think, probably I think that's a flaw in the plan. I mean, the plan is not this plan of coercing leaders with the threat of kidnapping until they do what you want is a really poorly thought out plan.
And just getting back to the beginning of our conversation, if removing a leader does not remove a regime, as you said, what does this say about Western assumption that removing Putin alone would end the war in Ukraine?
Exactly. I think that's, again, nobody likes these autocratic dictators, but they are produced by these systems. And ultimately, you look at Russian history and they haven't been outside of an authoritarian regime for more than a couple years out of the past century. You know, in the past 100 years, you literally have the Tsar, you have Stalin, you have a series of autocratic Soviet premiers, and then you have a few years where Russia had a real functioning democracy, and then you have 2 decades of Putin. And so clearly the regime, there's something in the structure that produces authoritarian countries. And I think this assumption that an individual is the state, I think that actually says something about President Trump, who he himself seems to really think that. Like, he thinks that if he were to have a heart attack tomorrow, that somehow the U.S. government itself would like collapse into chaos. But you know, and he can believe that and he can see himself that way, but that's not the reality. The U.S. government has persisted through presidents dying of natural causes, of assassinations. It's a very, very clear succession, and I think this assumption that governments are unstable or held together by a single strong man is kind of a farce. Even in Iraq, right, we took out Saddam, but we also disbanded the Iraqi army. We banned every member of the Ba'athist Party from serving in government. The U.S. went in and they didn't just remove Saddam, they actually deliberately took steps to completely wipe the slate clean of any qualified government officials. I think if they had done something different and kept more of those institutions intact, Iraq may have found itself under another different strongman, but they would have been more likely to have the chaos that emerged was not just because Saddam ended up getting arrested.
Yeah, absolutely. Paul, thank you so much for your time. It's such an interesting beginning of this year, quite promising. I'm saying that ironically, obviously. But I know something interesting is coming in America and probably in Iran. Also will be something interesting soon. So it's already happening. So Paul, thank you so much for your time, for your insights, and see you next time.
Yep. Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.